we look at today's passage, and of course, things are progressing pretty fast in this story of Ruth. And apparently, from what we read last week in chapter 2 to chapter 3 this week, Ruth has developed more feelings for Boaz and vice versa. And apparently, some of those feelings that Ruth is feeling is romantic affection and a desire for marriage. Now, we're not sure how much time has passed. We assume that since Naomi and Ruth come back to Bethlehem at the beginning of the harvest season, and this is nearing the end of the harvest season, we can say it's probably 2 or 3 months, but the Bible doesn't actually say how long, whether it's progressing that fast or maybe a little bit more than that. But what is happening between these two chapters? There are some feelings between both parties. Now, probably in modern day parlance, we would say that Ruth and Boaz are talking. And for anybody that's not a young millennial or Gen Z, that's where two parties are being friendly with one another and maybe something more than friends, but they're not really ready to say that they're dating. And yes, that's the new version. It's something more than friendship and a little bit less than courting or dating, and that's where we are in society. And this is where we pick up this story with Ruth and Boaz today. Now, Ruth, knowing that they're somewhere along the stages of maybe courtship or something, she wants to prove her faithfulness in this. Now, what's interesting is as she wants to try to understand where they're at, she essentially pops the question about marriage to Boaz. Now, we hear this and we go, well, even in our modern ears, that's kind of unusual for the woman to ask the man about marriage. Now, it's not to say that women don't drop hints and encourage it, but generally the asking to marry is still left for the man. And so Ruth is acting very boldly. We talked a little bit about that last week, that Ruth is very bold in what she does, and a lot of her boldness is done in faith that something will happen according to God's plan. And we talked about that last week, that her boldness and her faith are part of the bigger story of the book of Ruth, is have boldness in your faith to do what's needed. And so although maybe God is not as explicitly revealed in the book of Ruth, God is at work in those who are faithful and bold in their faith, like Ruth. And so God has apparently revealed himself to Ruth, and she is acting in faith that his plans will be accomplished by her boldness and maybe her untraditional proposal to Boaz. Now, this chapter is what literary professors and scholars would call the rising action. It's approaching the moment of the climactic part of the story of soap operas and romantic comedies and all that. And so Ruth wants to know if they're talking, if they're dating, if they're engaged, and so she is trying to push Boaz one way or the other. And so she sets out and she confides in Naomi, and she says, Naomi, it sounds like we've got to have a define the relationship talk, the so-called DTR talk. We needed to define this relationship, me and Boaz do. And she needs to know where things stand with her and Boaz. She needs to know, is she going to keep working for him and provide just enough for herself and Naomi? Is she going to be an employee of Boaz's, and he's going to make sure that she's taken care of well enough, but not as much as she'd like? Or is he going to marry her and provide for her completely? And what's interesting is, as she has this discussion and she talks about moving the relationship more, she borrows the same language we talked about last week about God enfolding her in his wings. As Boaz says, may the Lord bring his wings around you and protect you. And she says, well, maybe Boaz, you could spread your cloak around me. Now, the word for wings and cloak in chapter 2 and here in chapter 3, they're the same wording in the Hebrew. And so she's saying, yes, I hope that God will protect me in his wings. And Boaz, maybe you can be a man. Maybe you can help God to do that. Like, I know God will provide. Maybe he's sending you to be that provider and that redeemer for me. How about that? How about you man up and you do what is right to make sure that there's no doubt that the Lord's going to take care of me because he's already blessed you. Maybe he could bless me through you. How about that, Boaz? And puts the question to him to try to get him to move and not be so reserved or timid about what they're doing. And he tells her, I want to. I want to do that. He says, but I have to be real honest with you. And this is where we have the other part of the story as we're talking about this rising action is most of this chapter. There is always the climax, and there is and to get to the climax is overcoming the conflict in the story. And so this is where Boaz introduces the conflict. He says, Ruth, I want to marry you. I want to do that. I would love to provide for you and be your husband and do that. He says, and I'll redeem you. That's fine. But as far as me being the one to redeem you, I can only do that if there's nobody else closer to redeem you. And he says, and by the way, there is. He says, there's somebody who's a little bit more of a close relation to your late husband. And he says, and so they have right of first refusal to marry you and redeem you. So if you want to be redeemed, you have to approach him, or we have to have him sign off on it. And he says, so there's somebody a little bit more qualified to redeem you than me. So let me deal with him. Let me figure this out, and then I'll get back to you. So he does want to do this. Boaz wants to marry her and redeem her, but he says, I've got to deal with this first. I got to take care of this conflict. Now, what's interesting is how both Ruth and Boaz are not seen as the best qualified. Now, I think if we read this about, there being a closer redeemer, we who read this in terms of 21st century and in light of the New Testament, we hear this, and of course, we think about the closest redeemer that we have, that is Jesus Christ. Now, we talk about redemption and Jesus being a redeemer. And for us, redemption in most society has something to do with transactions. Now, I know back in the day, and I'll show my age on this, or lack of age, I guess. I know that there used to be the redemption stamps book, and you would get certain colors, and they would, and you could trade them in for certain products and things like that. I'm not exactly familiar with that. I know that when Cracker Jack moved from having prizes in the boxes, they went to, you could redeem proof of purchase on that, as well as on boxes of cereal and things like that. You could redeem proof of purchase on that. But most of our redeeming now that we talk about as transactional is when we go to the grocery store, and we have the loyalty ID, and you put in your loyalty ID, and for every dollar that you spend at the grocery store, you spend at the JC store, you get a point, and for every 100 points you have, when you go to the gas tank, either at the Kroger gas station or participating gas stations, it'll ask you to put in your Kroger ID, if you have enough points, every 100 points that you have in your loyalty account can be redeemed for 10 cents off on gas. And so, we try to look at that and say, well, I'm going to make sure to get most of my groceries at the JC and the Kroger stores, so that when I go to the Kroger or the JC gas stations to get my gas, I can use all those points and hope I have 500 points so I can get 50 cents off per gallon and be really good. We can redeem those. That's at least our familiarity with redeeming. But in today's passage, as we talk about redeeming, we learn that redeeming cannot be done by ourselves. We can't redeem ourselves from who we are. That has to be done for us. Now, for centuries, people tried to redeem themselves, or at least try to hold off the Lord's judgment, hoping for redemption with sheep and goats and bulls and doves and all these other sacrificial animals. But the author of Hebrews tells us that they were never going to ultimately save us. There is another Redeemer, that is Jesus. He has redeemed us from being unworthy. He has redeemed us, and He has paid off what we lost. When we talk about redeeming today, and we talk about redeeming the points from our JC purchases to get savings on our gas. Before you can redeem those points, in order to redeem those points, you've had to spend so much at the JC or Kroger stores, right? You've had to spend so much. So for every 100 points, you get the 10 cents off, right? Well, and if each dollar you spend is a point, that means you've had to spend at least $100. So you spend $100 at the JC or Kroger store, and then you can get 10 cents off in gas. So it's cost you at the grocery store for your groceries in order to be able to spend a little less when you redeem it at the gas tank. So there is a little bit of cost associated there. We don't always think of that. We just I think purchase and try to get the best value, but we don't necessarily think of that process for that. I think maybe we also forget about the cost for our redemption in terms of being redeemed by Jesus. It cost Jesus probably more than we really are willing to spend if we could redeem ourselves. I think that's why humanity, before Jesus came, was willing to spend the lives of innocent animals like those sheep and goats and bulls and doves and whatever. It didn't cost them that much. It cost them some because they would raise them, but it wouldn't cost them as much as a human life. It wouldn't cost them as much as their own life. But because Jesus was willing to pay that price, because God was willing to allow that price to be paid, we can find redemption. We can find that we are redeemed by that close Redeemer. We are redeemed by God's only begotten Son, who is regarded as our brother, our kinsman redeemer, as it were. Because Jesus is the first fruits of the resurrection and the redemption, we also have the hope of resurrection and redemption and the good news that is possible for us, that we are made worthy and saved from death and are provided for each and every day of our life if we trust in the one who has redeemed us by his blood, Jesus Christ. Amen.